regarded these summit organizations with pessimism or skepticism, because there are many who pretend that they promote science. Their science is actually propaganda. I will conclude by wishing success to all the speakers and hoping that at the end of this summit we shall have more arguments, more strength, and more means to protect normality. Thank you very much.
And now, here in front of you will come someone who doesn't need any presentation. He's known all over the world. Please applause for Dr. Malone.
The face and for the future, yes, we say. I've been asked to welcome you from the International Crisis Summit. On behalf of the organizers, it's my pleasure to welcome all of you to the meeting of the 4th International COVID Summit. I know that many of you traveled a long distance to attend, while others have come from across Europe and from here in Romania. The organizers thank you, all of you, for your commitment, time, and courage to participate. But we wish to thank the members of the Romanian government who are providing both this beautiful venue and their generous support. Now I'm asked to remind all presenters to stay within your allotted time. Please keep in mind that both the portrait and the spirit of Vlad the Impaler is here in this building, and we do not wish to have to call on him to enforce timelines. It seems simultaneously just yesterday and also a long time ago that the first International COVID Summit was convened in Rome, Italy, by invitation from a member of the Senate. So many things have changed since then. At that meeting, attendees were only allowed to speak about drug treatments, not about vaccine risks or effectiveness. This was the first major international meeting where physicians and scientists came together from across the world to compare notes and discuss successful ways to treat COVID and virtually eliminate hospitalization and death with a variety of early treatment protocols. The second ICS then followed in France and included discussion of masks, lockdowns, treatments, as well as vaccine concerns, and was also a great success. The third ICS convened recently at the European Parliament in Brussels, and video from that provided testimony has been viewed literally billions of times. With your help and support, I have no doubt that the fourth ICS will be another step forward in helping both Romania and the world make sense of what we have all experienced and point the way forward towards a better future for all of us. Now my introductory address. Friends, Romanians, physicians, lend me your ears. I come not to praise the top-down, authoritarian, centralized regulation of medicine endorsed by the mandarins of finance, governments, globalist organizations, and massive non-governmental organizations, but rather to bury it. It has now been 4 full years since a novel coronavirus first infected the human community. Laboratory engineered for enhanced human infectivity and disease, development of which was funded by the US government and performed by the US medical industrial complex working in cooperation with the Chinese Communist Party. Let's consider the most recent findings regarding the damage done by this top-down centralized approach. Skilled data scientists, including Dr. Jessica Rose here today, have recently estimated that excess United States deaths associated with the combination of non-pharmaceutical interventions and imposed medical interventions, which were neither safe nor effective, exceeded 500,000 US citizens. 500,000 excess avoidable deaths because of government top-down policies. Propagandists in the US government and CIA-influenced Johns Hopkins University tell us that there have been approximately 1 million US deaths from disease associated with the Wuhan seafood market virus infection, the initial name given to this pathogen. These propagandists, in cooperation with a modeling team led by Dr. Neil Ferguson from the Imperial College in the UK, have repeatedly told us that the case fatality rate of COVID-19 disease is 3.4%. This case fatality rate has been weaponized to justify jamming various drugs and, quote, vaccines through a highly abbreviated and corrupt, quote, emergency use authorization regulatory process, and then imposing these products, which have since proven to be neither safe nor effective, onto medical practitioners and the general public. These experimental products have been imposed in a centralized, top-down manner by a combination of censorship, psychological warfare propaganda, perverse financial incentives, suppression of bottom-up medical treatments developed and field-tested by practicing medical professionals, and targeted harassment and weaponization of the medical licensure process to attack and prevent any who have raised scientific and medical concerns from practicing medicine or participating in valid scientific discussions. In stark contrast to these centralized authoritarian policies, data from Sweden, a country which had refused to mandate these top-down policies and which has been repeatedly ridiculed for not following these centralized globalist-endorsed policies, demonstrates a SARS-CoV-2 case fatality rate of approximately 0.026%, not the 3.4% coincidentally used in both the original fall 2019 Hopkins CIA Gates Agenda 201 pandemic wargaming, as well as in the biased modeling results of the Neil Ferguson Imperial College modeling, 0.026% as opposed to 3.4%. Taking the actual Swedish data into consideration, skills data analysts have estimated the actual total U.S. death from COVID disease at 171,000, not 1 million. Let's take a moment to consider the history and current data concerning the recently emergency use authorized, quote, booster products. There is no medical emergency at this time. The incidence of both disease and death associated with COVID-19 has essentially reached baseline. This is worldwide. The declaration of medical emergency in the United States was formally terminated in May 2023. These products were designed based on advice from the FDA VRBPAC committee, which last summer predicted that the SARS-CoV-2 strain dominating the upcoming fall season now would be the fearsomely named Kraken isolate. By the time these products were ready to be jammed through FDA regulatory authorization, the Kraken variant had been made extinct by the Eris variant, which was more infectious, less susceptible to antibody neutralization, and was associated with clinical symptoms, per the CDC, virtually indistinguishable from the common cold. Confronting the paradox of vaccine strain mismatch between Kraken and Eris, FDA and CDC relied on immunized mouse serum samples and an unvalidated serum neutralization test to assert that the Kraken boosters were sufficiently cross-reactive to the Eris variant, without actually sharing the data and analyses with external reviewers, to justify authorization and marketing this product to infants, children, adolescents, and adults. Just a short period after introduction of these products, a government-coordinated propaganda campaign in the United States has resulted in a total of 7% uptake of these products in U.S. adults and 2 to 3% uptake in the pediatric population. By the way, I call that a win. Now, under the selection pressure associated with global administration of these leaky vaccine products, we see evolution of a newly dominant variant, HV.1. This variant now paradoxically incorporates an element or epitope from the distant Delta strain and is highly resistant to neutralizing antibodies. There are no data indicating that HV.1 is neutralized by antibodies elicited by the current Kraken booster. What this history demonstrates is that the modified mRNA vaccine platform, even with an FDA willing to bypass safety and efficacy norms, developed over decades of experience, and willing to jam products through a regulatory authorization process using, quote, emergency use authorization, still cannot keep up with a rapidly evolving RNA respiratory virus, which, as predicted, has become both more highly infectious and relatively non-pathogenic. The centralized authoritarian global response to the entry of this engineered virus into the human population 4 years ago has clearly been an abysmal failure. Now let's consider the latest information about this technology and the purity of the vaccine products. When confronted by reporters from Trial Site News and Epoch Times, the FDA has resorted to stonewalling. The FDA has issued a categorical denial of adulteration risk, stating that, quote, no safety concerns related to the sequence of or amount of residual DNA in these, quote, vaccine products has been identified. The claim that the FDA is required to take any of the authorized or approved mRNA COVID-19 vaccines off the market is false, according to the FDA. With over 1 billion doses of the mRNA vaccines administered, no safety concerns relating to the sequence of or amount of residual DNA have been identified. With regard to the FDA-approved mRNA vaccines, available scientific evidence supports the conclusion they are safe and effective. This is the position of the FDA and, by the way, the European Medicines Agency and Health Canada. In contrast, multiple Moderna U.S. patents disclose that Moderna is aware of the genotoxicity risks of DNA when delivered into patients by highly active non-viral lipid nanoparticle delivery systems, and these risks include the risk of genotoxicity, resulting in, I'm quoting from Moderna's patents, quote, problems including the possibility of insertional mutagenesis, which could lead to the activation of oncogenes or the inhibition of tumor suppressor genes. That's Moderna's own words. In contrast to the perverse, obscene tragedy associated with this centralized top-down approach, which has been endorsed and promoted by the mandarins of finance governments, globalist organizations, and massive non-governmental organizations, today you will hear presentations and testimony from physicians and scientists, today and tomorrow, demonstrating that the traditional bottom-up approach of focusing on treatment of symptoms by repurposing the existing pharmacopoeia to prevent disease and death from a highly inflammatory respiratory virus was far superior to the centralized top-down approach. If nothing else, due in large part to those with courage to speak scientific and medical truth to power, the world is increasingly becoming aware that the propaganda of the COVID crisis and the centralized top-down approach has been a fraud. In attempting to weaponize this fraud for a variety of purposes, including financial, we have all been subjected to the most amazing, centralized, and globalized propaganda and psychological warfare campaign in modern history. Going forward, we're emerging into a postmodern, surrealistic information landscape where truth has become subject to a postmodern golden rule. Those with the gold make the rules. Permitted truth, quote unquote, has become entirely subjective, a distorted narrative propagated by public-private partnerships. People here in Romania understand what that means. They understand fascism, and they understand authoritarian, totalitarian governments, if anybody does. Between public-private partnerships, between governments, NGO, and the intelligence community, and corporate media. This is a mockingbird campaign. We have seen the modern embodiment of Operation Mockingbird, which has been in operation in the United States intelligence community since 1942. This is our opponent. Medical freedom and personal autonomy is certainly important, but even more important is freedom and personal sovereignty. When governments are willing and able to deploy modern cyber capabilities on their citizens, then election integrity becomes almost completely moot. And we are all at risk of becoming functionally lobotomized, indentured servants rather than independent individuals empowered to pursue our own destiny. Now, allow me just a brief additional moment to survey the published peer-reviewed literature relating to the human medical damages or adverse events associated with these products. I prepared, together with Dr. Jill Glaspel-Malone, and curated a list of over 750 published peer-reviewed academic papers describing COVID genetic vaccine-related adverse events. Dr. Trozzi has prepared a similar list with over 1,000 peer-reviewed references, which can be found on his website. The list of published adverse event types stands in stark contrast to the list of over 6,000 published and curated peer-reviewed publications which focus on how to overcome vaccine hesitancy. 1,000 on adverse events, over 6,000 basically on propaganda coming from academia. The adverse event publications fall into the following broad categories: coagulopathy or blood clotting problems, immune issues, autoimmunity, Guillain-Barré syndrome, myopericarditis, non-stroke neurologic disease, ocular disease of the eyes, other adverse events, including death, reproductive issues, rhabdomyolysis, this is destruction of muscle, stroke, tachycardia, rapid heartbeat, thrombocytopenia, reduced blood platelets, which contributes to the clotting problems, tinnitus, ringing in the ears, one of the most common adverse events, and transverse myelitis. This is damage to the spinal cord that causes paralysis below that level. It is past time to resist and bury these centralized, totalitarian, authoritarian policies which are being deployed to advance corporatist, globalist interests. And defense of medical freedom is a pretty good place to start. In closing, never forget the wisdom of St. Augustine. The truth is like a lion, and you do not need to defend it. Set it free, and it will defend itself. So be a lion, not a victim. Thank you for your time.
First of all, let me say that it's an honor and privilege to speak here just after Professor Robert Malone, the real inventor of mRNA technology. So those two Nobel Prizes for medicine should have been given to him, not to those guys that I never even don't remember their names. Thank you, Professor Malone. I have many Romanian friends in Italy. I travel around the entire world, visiting almost 100 countries, but this is my first time in Romania, and I love it. I also have friends in Bucharest, important friends. An artist, a well-known painter abroad in Italy and in England, Lady Maria Margherita Pacret, for French Yucca Rumens, that was supposed to be here today, but unfortunately she had a small accident. I also know His Royal Highness Prince Paul Hohenzollern-Coburg-Gotha of Romania, direct nephew of King Carol II, that more than 30 years ago asked me, "Dear Andrea, if I'll become a king, how I could thank you for your friendship and help. Would you like a Romanian nobiliary title?" "Oh yes, please. I dream to become Count of Transylvania." Then he said, "If I'll become King of Romania." I'm not Count of Transylvania, as you know. Here I feel home, even if it's my second day in Romania. Allow me to thank the enlightened Romanian parliamentarians for the invitation to this prestigious institution in which I had the honor of speaking, and the efficient organizer, Lily and Robert, of the ICS, now in its 4th edition after Rome, Paris, and Brussels. Not only because I'm here, but because today marks the centenary of the birth of Countess Nelly Ponzio Stramezzi, my mother, who passed away when I was a young university researcher, who taught me the love for culture, together with my father Pietro, doctor as well, who taught me everything, starting from critical conscience, the search for truth, freedom, and justice, and personal research for excellence. It's only thanks to them that I'm here and that I have saved thousands of lives in the last terrible years. Due to the powerful puppeteers of too many politicians in the Western world, perhaps want to take away the doctor's freedom with the intent declared to the World Economic Forum of decreasing the world population and at the same time enriching their enormous asset. The pandemic in Western countries was the most serious and planned blow to the freedom of the doctor. Absurd and illogical guidelines and provisions for doctors to which we were forced to adapt without discussion. Unfortunately, over 90% of colleagues submitted or enthusiastically joined without critical awareness. This led to millions of deaths, almost 200,000 in Italy alone, which if the doctors had reasoned, treated as they knew how, and protested, almost all of them could have been saved. Less than 10% ignored protocols and treated in science and consent, saving lives, and some of them are here today. I myself have saved almost 10,000 lives starting already in mid-March 2020 using my knowledge learned at the Faculty of Medicine more than 40 years ago and reading the most recent literature, including a paper by Didier Raoult and one by Anthony Fauci on the first SARS. At ICS4 at the European Parliament, I showed a circular from the hospital of Bergamo, where it all began in the Western world, dated March 27th, 2020, which recommended the same early treatment that I already prescribed, both inpatient and outpatient, and which thousands of doctors throughout the Western world were already prescribing or have soon started prescribing. Many stop me on the street or write to me telling me that I am a hero or that I was a courageous doctor. We were all not heroes, I reply. We only did our duty. Courageous doctor, yes, we were, but not because we challenged the institution, denouncing their lies. The word coraggio, courage, Italian, French, and English, derives from the union of two Latin words, which are heart and act. Courage means acting from the heart, and we all act with our heart, with love. So yes, we are courageous doctors, but above all, we were free men who reasoned with their own minds, not with a collective one indicated by the authorities. The limitation of the doctor's freedom began 30 years earlier, when they introduced the guidelines and protocols. The excuse was to standardize therapy so that even patients who lived in disadvantaged areas or who did not have a luminary as a doctor could have the best possible care. Demagogy. To the doctors, given that there had been an exponential growth in civil and criminal cases for malpractice, and that the defensive medicine was being borne, they explained that by following guidelines, they would not have problems in the courts. The concept was clear. If you treat 100 patients following the guidelines and 50 of them die, you risk nothing. If you do your own thinking, going outside the guideline and treating them the same 100 patients and only one of them dies, you risk prison and financial ruin. That's why. This is the modern, This is the moment in which, for the first time, the doctors gave up part of his freedom of thought and independence, written in Hippocratic Oath. But who are the guidelines written by and how? A bureaucrat from a health authority writes them sitting behind a desk, not a doctor who treats patients on the front line or at the bedside. And he writes them based on evidence-based medicine, taken from the literature. Let's take a step back. Until a few years earlier, scientific journals were in paper form, or at most on CD, compact disc, and you had to pay a subscription to get them. I subscribed to various magazines and also to Medline quarterly CDs. Doctor Office had huge shelves with magazine collections containing decades of issues of each journal. Every hospital or university clinic had large libraries filled with bound volumes. To do bibliographic research before making a publication, I myself spent entire weeks leafing through magazines. Then they all become free and online, much more convenient. But who finances them? Big Pharma. And who finances research centers, as well as a researcher or scientific society today? Big Pharma. Sorry. You will understand that the guidelines are indirectly written by Big Pharma, which has an interest in having its own drugs included in the guidelines. And if the doctor does not follow the guidelines by not prescribing that drug, he risks a big risk. Another piece of freedom of choice is gone. But let's go back to today. The code of ethics of medical association are also changing. In Italy, the FNOMCEO, the National College of Physicians, is changing the code of ethics about vaccine. Vaccine, you know, is the drug that can be sold for healthy people who are many more than sick people, providing that if a doctor advises against any vaccine to any patient with any pathology, must be automatically removed. And of freedom, and of therapy, and of critical thinking. But their plan goes further. In recent years, bureaucratic tasks have tripled for physicians, so that doctors have less time to dedicate to visiting patients and thinking. With COVID, they even recommended the doctors not to go home to visit the patients, not to give treatment, and to send them to hospital when they became serious. But it's still not enough from them. There is the risk that some sovereign and democratic nation elects a doctor as a Minister of Health who think with a critical conscience how to do. Delegating health sovereignty to a private international company, WHO. No need to tell you from who it's financed, by who. Which itself can declare a pandemic alert and will immediately assume the power of health minister of every country associated member, and will be able to impose lockdowns, guidelines, and even mandatory vaccination. On May 24th, 2024, all WHO member nations will have to ratify this blank delegation. But again, it's not enough for them. On the same day, the international health regulation will also be voted on, which provides for other obligations and restrictions on freedom. But this is even more subtle as advocate Renate Holzeisen, who will speak later, teach us. Since if it passes with a simple majority, even the opposing nation will be forced to adopt it. This is very, very serious. There is always the risk, unacceptable for them, of finding a free spirit like them, who does not want to accept harming their citizen or their patient. And this is where technology comes into play. Telemedicine and artificial intelligence, which are already being advertised as saving technology, let's be clear, all is just a tool. AI is just a tool. It's not good and it's not bad. It depends on how you use it. But in your opinion, which will be the economic and technological powers that will implement data in AI, which will give the answer that they have predicted? Big Pharma. AI, if you ask for a diagnosis and therapy based on your symptoms and pathologies, will give you an unequivocal answer, diagnosing you with a pathology that perhaps you don't have. The most classic example is the hypercholesterolemia, whose warning levels have been lowered several times to prescribe people statins. So, we are talking about a pathology that perhaps you do not have, prescribing you that drug that perhaps you do not need, and which perhaps will also have adverse effects on you. The doctor will no longer have freedom, indeed. The figure of the doctor will abolished, cancelled. Perhaps only one person will remain to push buttons for confirmation and validation. Science fiction? No, dear colleagues, reality. It already exists, and it's called Care Pods. Forward Health, a company founded in 2016, has already opened technological advanced medical practice in which body scanners, intelligent sensor, and diagnostic algorithms replace medical personnel. Today, CarePods, it's a cabin with a large touch screen and friendly voice that guides the patient through an infinite number of tests and checkups for cardiology, diabetes, autoimmune pathology, visits, etc. All conducted by artificial intelligence, and the patient comes out with a diagnosis and prescription, which is validated by a doctor by pressing a button remotely. The subscription costs $99 only, and entitles you to blood tests, many health apps, 24-hour assistant team, and unlimited virtual visits. Convenient, right? Sorry, what's happening? Was the last, can you go back? The last, okay. For now, 25 units are already operational. For World Health CEO, Mr. Adrian Aoun, expects the first 3,200 care pods to be installed within a year. In 2 years, there will be tens of thousands of these machines. Mala tempora currunt, sed peiora parantum, for the translator, the way I will translate. We are living in bad times, but worse ones are ahead. Dear courageous medical colleagues and scientists from all over the world, and you too, enlightened Romanian parliamentarians, we must react now, or we will all be massacred. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you to the gracious members of the European Parliament and their staff for hosting this summit. Thank you to the organizers. And thank you to those who still support open dialogue about complex and controversial scientific and medical topics. I would like to begin by voluntarily placing myself under oath. I will use this electronic version of the Bible on my cell phone. Before God, and those of you present here, I swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help me God. I am an associate professor of viral immunology. I'm also a vaccinologist. All of the experts in this room today have experienced brutal and chronic attacks by people who proclaim to be misinformation experts. Everyone here could spend hours sharing their experiences and insights on this topic. On behalf of my colleagues, I would like to share with you a brief overview of some insights into the world of those purporting to tackle misinformation in the name of public health. Mine is a Canadian perspective, but other professionals here can confirm that it is a common set of strategies used by misinformation experts around the globe. So let me introduce you to the person deputized as Canada's leading expert on identifying and combating health misinformation. His name is Mr. Timothy Caulfield. I almost referred to him as Dr. Caulfield, but he only holds a master's degree in law. Despite this, he's a self-professed expert at identifying misinformation in all areas of health science. He's a professor at a Canadian university and runs a national network of so-called misinformation experts that is called Science Up First. The Government of Canada recently awarded Mr. Caulfield the Order of Canada for his efforts in combating health misinformation throughout the declared COVID-19 pandemic. Like many in his field, he's a strong proponent of disciplining those deemed to have spread misinformation, including, as you can see here, levying fines. A purported expert panel on the socioeconomic impacts of science and health misinformation was recently appointed to generate a report called Fault Lines. Among many discussion points was the potential to criminalize the spread of misinformation. Although admittedly challenging in countries with strong policies for freedom of expression, it was noted that some countries, including some in Europe, are leading the way in terms of testing these waters. Next slide, please. The European Commission has identified the rise of mis and disinformation as a major challenge for public health experts. Fighting mis and disinformation and improving vaccine confidence are objectives shared by the European Commission and European Union member states. So a key question arises from this. Who are going to be the arbiters of truth in a war on misinformation? Many power brokers argue that this should be done by the misinformation experts. To support this, they attempt to legitimize these individuals and groups by bestowing them with honors and awards. However, my experience and that of the other professionals assembled here is that many of these misinformation experts are people of poor character who are often wildly off base with the claims they make. So when I began investigating the world of misinformation experts, I logically hypothesized that their field must be founded on pseudoscience. To my surprise, there are solid peer-reviewed publications and other sources of primary data to support efforts to identify and combat genuine pieces of misinformation. I learned this by watching lectures given by misinformation experts and reviewing some of the literature. For example, although it seemed like common sense to me, there's a good body of evidence demonstrating that public discourse about conflicting scientific opinions is an effective way to counter misinformation. Even discourse, or open discourse, even works when dealing with so-called science deniers, let alone genuine scientists. This inherently makes sense because it becomes readily apparent to onlookers of a real-time discussion when a person lacks expertise and/or evidence. In fact, when it comes to countering misinformation, not turning up to the discussion at all seems to result in the worst effect. Disturbingly, however, those who preach these facts often fail to put them into practice. Almost none have been willing to engage any expert that they accuse of spreading misinformation in any kind of public discussion, even one in which both parties would simply be given parallel opportunities by a third-party moderator to address questions from the public, as opposed to traditional scholarly debates. But remember, not turning up to the discussion at all seems to result in the worst effect. Here's a list of data-backed strategies for debunking misinformation. It looked like a solid list to me. So I thought I would delve into the murky waters of social media as an observer to see how these rules are applied by world-renowned misinformation experts, particularly those who refuse to engage in real-time public discussions. In the case of Order of Canada winner Mr. Caulfield, he has often espoused the strategy of taking screenshots of messages containing misinformation and overlaying them with notes to explain how the science is wrong. Let's look at just a few examples. This is a screenshot about a BBC news broadcast in which a cardiologist expressed concern that COVID-19 shots might be contributing to a rise in excess cardiac mortalities in the United Kingdom. Bearing in mind the importance of providing trustworthy and independent references and highlighting gaps in knowledge, please read along with me. What the F-bomb, British Broadcasting Corporation? No, 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 no. Well, isn't that insightful? I'm glad that my tax dollars are being invested in this kind of academic work. How about the use of clear and shareable content and making facts the hook? Again, read with me. Wrong, 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 wrong. Sigh. Fascinating. How about providing the science and being nice, authentic, empathetic, and humble, as the science suggests? Dear anti-vaxxers, aren't you all about doing your own research? Every time we, that is, the science-informed and less off the rails, highlight your feces from a bull, we are not obligated to provide a list of references that vaccines work. You are making the extraordinary claims. Onus is on you. So what I learned is that one provides the science by not providing the science. The behaviors of many misinformation experts seem unprofessional, but are they genuine truth tellers? After all, it only takes one case of spreading misinformation to be deemed a spreader of misinformation. So I evaluated some of the authors of the Fault Lines report. Remember, these were deemed to be elite misinformation experts. Here, Mr. Cleish was promoting a claim that a study showed no effect of COVID-19 vaccines on sudden cardiac deaths of college athletes. So I reviewed the publication. Remarkably, the paper had nothing to do with COVID-19 vaccines. The lack of association was between people getting infected with SARS-CoV-2 and sudden cardiac deaths. In other words, the results suggest there was no evidence to link the disease, called COVID-19, with fatal myocarditis in varsity athletes. This is an egregious example of an elite misinformation expert spreading misinformation. Mr. Caulfield has been a prolific disseminator of misinformation. Here's a single example in which he was aghast that some Americans believed the conspiracy theory that SARS-CoV-2 might have been the result of gain-of-function research. The avalanche of data on this topic clearly legitimized this hypothesis. It is important to note that real experts can find concerning patterns in relatively limited data sets well in advance of the much larger amounts of data needed by non-experts. Mr. Mai runs a misinformation dashboard that scours the internet for fact checks and compiles the results. It assumes that fact checks are infallible. Here are the results compiled from the past 3 years. Out of 3,742 claims that were evaluated, only 15, or 0.4%, were deemed to be true. And the true fact checks focused on simple and non-controversial topics. This accurately recapitulates the massive biases that exist in the fact-checking industry. If fact checks are wrong, then Dr. Mai would be spreading misinformation via this publicly available dashboard. So I investigated the topic of the spike protein, which is something that I am familiar with. One of the fact checks claimed that my concern about the potential for spike proteins to mediate harm in the body was false. They cited Mr. Caulfield's Science Up First organization as a source of proof that the spike derived from modified RNA shots could not bind to its ACE2 receptor properly and therefore could not cause harm. They provided a reference. It turns out that the Science Up First organization completely misinterpreted the scientific paper. It never investigated the bioactivity of spike proteins in the body. Instead, it appears that they mistook the phrase "without evidence of immunopathology" to mean that the spike could not cause harm in the body. Instead, the phrase means there was no evidence of vaccine-enhanced disease. This is what happens when non-immunologists claim expertise in immunology. In fact, it is well known that the spike generated by modified RNA shots can bind with high affinity to the ACE2 receptor. So here is an example of an entire organization dedicated to debunking misinformation, creating and promoting misinformation. This also makes Mr. Mai complicit in the spread of misinformation. Also, his dashboard has no strategy for correcting the record when things previously deemed false are in fact correct. After all, fact checks do not get retracted or corrected. With fact checkers being viewed as arbiters of truth, it is important to note that many of them merely spread propaganda. Fact-checking is farcical for numerous reasons, but has become weaponized to promote groupthink and defame dissenting experts. Fact-checking organizations should be defunded and dismantled. A trick used by fact-checkers and misinformation experts is to critique excerpts from messages being provided off the cuff to lay audiences. They critique this superficial information as though the expert in question has just published a polished scientific paper that is ready for peer review. This is why the public must insist on open, real-time discussions of controversial science. Here's an example of 88 colleagues at my university telling the world in an open letter that I spread misinformation in a radio interview in which I could only address a fraction of my concerns in lay language. I had suggested there was evidence that spike proteins might get transferred to suckling infants of recently vaccinated mothers, and that this was deserving of research. My colleagues definitively told the public, and I quote, and this was with no reference to data, "The spike protein generated by vaccines does not pass through breast milk." Now look at these two peer-reviewed scientific papers published in reputable journals. It turns out that my 88 colleagues spread egregious misinformation to the public. It also shows that supporting an opinion with a large number of non-vaccinologists does not define what the truth is about a vaccine. Yet this was and is still being used to destroy my career and many other aspects of my life. I'm going to show you how this interfaces with bigger issues. Note here that the Canadian legal system supports judicial notice being taken of regulatory approval. This is founded upon the belief that public health officers will perform their tasks properly, carefully, and honestly. Reports generated by public officials have been predetermined by our courts to be inherently reliable and trustworthy. Further, public officials are not to be inconvenienced by having to be present in court to prove that their reports are correct. In contrast, subject matter experts can be subjected to the inconvenience of having to be present in court, only to have so-called fact checks used to downgrade the reliability of their information. If judicial notice is to be taken for public health messages, one needs to ask if these agencies are truly looking after the best interests of the public. Concerns arise from the fact that many regulatory bodies around the world have transitioned from being funded by taxpayers to being almost entirely funded by the pharmaceutical companies that they are tasked with policing. Companies pay regulators massive fees to have their applications reviewed, and the introduction of performance standards means there is the risk of losing as much as an entire reviewer's salary if things aren't done quickly. The net result of this is that the safety of drugs has declined. For example, drugs that get approved in a 300-day review process have about a 20% chance of having a serious safety warning identified after the rollout to the public. This increases to a 1 in 3 chance if the approval process is reduced to 180 days. Many regulators around the world have adopted similar models. The European Medicines Agency now receives 89% of its funding from industry. It is 96% for Australia's Therapeutic Goods Administration. Key concerns arising from my research are that debunking of misinformation is being done under the guise of promoting public health, is a tool used to censor experts that have scientifically valid concerns, and is being used to destroy their careers. However, misinformation experts are prolific spreaders of misinformation, and this can be definitively proven. This is often being funded by taxpayers and supported by publicly funded academic institutions. Although there is science outlining how to identify and debunk misinformation, it is all too often practiced as a nefarious art by the so-called experts. Genuine subject matter experts sharing inconvenient truths need immediate help. They must be protected against censorship. A researcher's reputation dictates their success in obtaining funding. Healthcare professionals and scientists are being punished, defamed, and are losing jobs because of so-called misinformation gurus who lack expertise, lack integrity, lack professionalism, and are, in and of themselves, profound spreaders of misinformation. They are misleading the public and discouraging open discussions of matters of global health. For the sake of global public health, protecting bodily autonomy, and protecting freedom of speech, the deputization of misinformation experts must be stopped. These people and those who support them need to be investigated and brought to justice. Otherwise, here's an example of how discombobulated our world can become. These are 108 peer-reviewed scientific references. Those who censored honest and caring subject matter experts ignored the overwhelming evidence proving the validity and superiority of naturally acquired immunity against SARS coronavirus 2. A huge swath of the public was convinced that the immune system could no longer function naturally. They were also led to believe that holding a certificate showing injections with 2 needles trumped any proof of immunity. Even though the purpose of a vaccine is to induce an immune response, and not all people respond to vaccination. This led to horrific cases like this one. Miss Sheila Lewis, a mother and grandmother, was denied a life-saving transplant and allowed to suffer a horrific death because she had proof of broad and robust immunity against SARS coronavirus 2. But it was acquired naturally rather than by injections. The world is in big trouble when physicians making life and death decisions no longer understand that proof of gold standard, naturally acquired immunity is always superior to certification of receipt of injections. Censorship under the guise of public health must stop. Thank you very much. And it's my pleasure now to introduce to you my fellow Canadian who's speaking next, Mr. Jason Christoff.
Ladies and gentlemen, can we take a moment of silence for the victims of the COVID operation? Many people have died and many people are injured. I would also like to say, God bless the strength of the Romanian people. God bless Romania. God bless the Romanian leadership. And God bless this amazing structure that are housing the event today. So thank you very much. My name is Jason Christoph, and today I will be doing my Media Over Medicine presentation. And an important question to start is, was the government's global response to COVID based on clinical virology or behavioral psychology? And other questions that are very important to ask would revolve around, does the media have the power to make our decisions for us through the use of psychological group pressure tactics? Can group pressure, our fear of the crowd, force us to make illogical decisions which aren't in the best interest of ourselves, our loved ones, or our communities? Was the public exposed to any group pressure psychological manipulation tactics during the COVID operation? The next slide is a 2-minute video. Will demonstrate very clearly the power of group pressure to modify human behavior. It should play.
The Ash experiment is one of psychology's oldest and most popular pieces of research. A volunteer is told that he's taking part in a visual perception test. What he doesn't know is that the other participants are actors, and he's the only person taking part in the real test, which is actually about group conformity.
The experiment you will be taking part in today involves the perception of line length. Your task will be simply to look at the line here on the left and indicate which of the 3 lines on the right is equal to any length. So, for example,
The actors are meant to match the wrong lines. The volunteer will be monitored to see if he gives the correct answer, or if he goes along with the opinion of the group and gives the wrong answer. In the first test, the correct answer is 2. Once again, the correct answer is 2. 3.
the Ash experiment has been repeated many times, and the results are really astonishing. We will conform to the group again. Very social creatures are very much aware of what people around us think. We want to be liked. We don't want to be seen wrong, so we go along with the group, even if we don't believe what people are saying. We still go along.
Group dynamics is one of the most powerful forces in human psychology.
I hope people could hear that. I know they couldn't hear it too clearly, but the results of the Ash conformity experiment were shocking, to say the least. 50% of participants conformed to fabricated group pressure and gave the wrong answer, with the majority knowing that the answer was wrong. Secret answers given on paper to the instructor reduced group conformity to only 12%. So if your answer was secret, you would be less likely to conform to the group pressure. Only 25% of people stood up to give the fabricated group pressure, stood up to the fabricated group pressure to give the right and truthful answer. In psychology, we call them fully functional adults. And anybody speaking here today involved with this event is a fully functional adult, and thank you for that. I'm not too sure what's going on with the slides, but I'll walk you through everything. People who conformed to the group pressure and gave the wrong answer, they were basically low status, high need for approval types. Most were also from cultures that honored obedience to authority. Most were people who defined their self-worth by what others thought of them. In clinical psychology, there are people who are weak mentally, known as the forever child, people who have somehow bypassed their proper rite of passage from child to adult. These people are the most conformist. And a society of adults who act, talk, and think like children cannot survive. Basically, there are other factors that increase group conformity. The more psychological fear a person is in, the more they conform to group pressure based on fear-based changes in brain function. The more chemical fear a person is in, caffeine, alcohol, junk food, they conform more to group pressure because it's the same changes in brain function. Your body is afraid of poison. And this is why the bottle shops, the weed shops in Canada, the fast food restaurants and the corner stores were opened during a health crisis. Fear shuts down critical thinking and increases conformist behavior, irrational and illogical behavior as well. And has anybody seen any parts of the public exhibiting irrational and illogical behavior from 2020 forward? Obviously, the answer would be yes. So psychology experts also chime in on how to best control the public. Dr. Juice Merleau, author of the book Rape of the Mind and Psychology of Thought Control, recounted that keeping a victim confused is the best for psychological control and manipulation. Dr. Merleau also recounted that with the training of any animal, it's best to train the human animal in isolation away from the others. Similar to training horses, similar to training dogs, you get them away from the others. Merleau further recounted, after studying Korean War POWs, that mind controlling a person was best served with periods of intense attack and fear broken up by periods of peace and favored treatment, again to confuse the victim and again to control the victim through confusion. Edward Bernays, author of the books Propaganda and Crystallizing Public Opinion, explained that the crowd wasn't even needed physically to build the group pressure that changed the victim's mind. Sitting in a room alone with your TV during the 14 days to flatten the curve and only perceiving the power of an imaginary group on the TV screen can indeed bring about conformity to that imaginary group. Other ways that fear can be used to control the public in the research. Stockholm Syndrome was a phrase coined by psychiatrist Niels Bergerath after a 5-day bank robbery standoff in Stockholm, Sweden. There's a picture of the inside of the bank in the shot. Many bank tellers taken hostage became sympathetic to their captors and even romantically involved after the heist was over under the immense trauma, fear, and stress. Demonstrations of an immense public power can trigger a survival response of trauma bonding with the abusers and endorsing of the abuser for fear of reprisal. And we saw many people do that in 2020. They sided with the government, not because the government was making sense, but because the government was a bully. That's why. We've learned a lot in the Milgram experiment, sort of the power of the white coat. In the Milgram experiment, just over 50% of research subjects would execute orders to kill or injure another human being if the order came from someone of authority, someone with a title, and someone in a lab coat. Here we have Dr. Anthony Fauci. He is someone of authority, someone with a title, and someone in a lab coat, and he is telling people what to be afraid of, and he's also telling people how to relieve the fear. And in the Milgram experiment, people were manipulated to potentially hurt and kill others. In the COVID experiment, it appears they were manipulated to injure and kill themselves. This is a weaponization of psychology against the public. Was psychology used against the public during COVID? Organizations like the UK's SAGE, standing for the Safety Advisory Group for Emergencies, and the International BIT Corporation, Behavioral Insights Team, admitted openly to using nudge-style psychological manipulation on the public during COVID in order to achieve their desired outcomes. These outcomes appeared one-sided, and they appeared so because they treated us like animals. And you can see that of the photos inside the slide. We were isolated and trained effectively in that isolation. As Dr. Just Merleau described, fear was upregulated into the stratosphere in order to lower IQ and increase conformist behaviors inside the limbic system via the fear response. When the human animals, us, were getting trained in COVID isolation by our instructor, the TV set, the opinion of the perceived crowd was repetitively imprinted into us by the media, thus leading to behavior and belief-altering group compliance, as Ash had documented, without the group being physically present, as Bernays had cited. The public were kept in perpetual states of confusion with contradictory messages. Gyms had to close during a health crisis, but bottle shops were open. Masks weren't necessary at the beginning, we were told. Then one was necessary, then two, then no masks if you complied, then masks back on for everybody. Then suddenly, magically, masks did not matter. The virus attacked at 10:01, but not at 9:59, because we know the virus carries a stopwatch everywhere it goes. The virus also attacked when you were standing at a restaurant, but not when you were sitting, because the virus also carries a tape measure. Confusion is the foundation of all mind control, according to Dr. Merleau. Then came the public exposure of people's vaccine status with the work mandates, triggering Ash's 50% or more higher compliance to group pressure compared to the 12% compliance level if our decisions are kept private to ourselves. They outed our vaccine status to get 4 to 5 times more vaccine uptake. This, again, is a weaponization of the known psychological research. The cycling of terror and more normal periods of peace and favored treatment were relentless, which kept the human psyche in a permanent state of instability, optimal for controlling the masses, according to Dr. Merleau. Businesses were open, businesses were closed, you had to wear a mask, you take your mask off, all very confusing, and it worked exactly as designed. Were the police told by the government, please focus on the photos here, were the police told by governments to be as heavy-handed as possible in order to induce Stockholm Syndrome trauma bonding with authority, plus upregulate fear around a COVID narrative obviously made of pure wind? So again, the question remains, was the government's response to COVID based on clinical virology or behavioral psychology? The public are generally aware that crimes have been committed. Morality, ethics, and justice must be reinvigorated in all levels of our society, from the ground up. Charges must be laid, criminal investigations initiated, and criminal conspirators punished to the highest order. Never again shall such blatant psychological manipulation be used by government against its own citizens. God and good always wins. Always. This is Jason Christoph. Thank you for listening.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to be here in Romania. As an Italian lawyer, I wish the Italian citizen opposed these crazy measures like the Romanian population. And therefore, I have to say, we are in an incredible situation. We have democracy in Romania, where democracy was cancelled in most part of the European Union. So, I'm here to talk about the restriction, the annulment of freedoms and rights, especially in the European Union. As Romania is also part of the European Union, I try to introduce you especially on the high risk of power grab we as European Union citizens are facing. So, what we are talking about? As you know, it is planned by the WHO to reform itself on the basis of two legal instruments, the new pandemic treaty and the amendments to the existing international health regulations. And the declared reason is to be better prepared to future pandemics, but the real reason is to install world government and to take the sovereignty of our states. So what are we talking about? The international health regulations exist, are already in force, and they will modify them on the World Health Assembly in May of next year, and by simple majority. And they will enter into force after 12 months. That means on June the 1st of 2025, except the WHO member state rejects this modification. But I will explain you afterwards that the European Union, by the Council and the European Parliament, has already decided to follow the modification of this international health regulation. That is the great problem. So, and then we have the treaty. The treaty has to be voted by a 2/3 majority, and for the treaty there is a request of the domestic ratification by the respective parliament. So as the really high risk is the modification of the international health regulation, because because it will enter into force automatically without any ratification by the domestic parliament, I will focus especially on the draft of the modification of the international health regulation. So, what is the concrete future prospect? A loss of sovereignty of our states, disproportionate damaging measures, loss of property, loss of health. And why now we are going to see the single articles of the international health regulation which are going to be modified. So we have the Article 12, where it is foreseen that the Director General will be in the future the authoritarian power to decide if we have a public health emergency, not only of international concern, but also of regional concern. And the problem is that this public health emergency according to Annex 2 of the International Health Regulation will be able to, the public health emergency of international concern or also of regional concern will be able to, will be declared also in the case of a cluster of severe infections in which human-to-human transmission cannot be ruled out. So this definition means that there is a total discretion in the person of the Director General, because you know a virus naturally is transmitted from human to human. So we see that this Article 12 and the Annex 2 will introduce a mechanism for self-empowerment of the WHO, and that means that we already faced in these last years that the WHO declared not scientific, without any scientific evidence, a pandemic. And we had this public health emergency of international concern running for more than 3 years. So what is also important is to point out that there will be introduced the principle of the One Health approach, and this principle we will find also in the regulations already voted in the European Union. So this One Health approach means that the decision the WHO will make regard everything, every kind of policy. So the WHO is giving unlimited possibilities to declare the pandemic emergency, as we have already seen. And what does that mean, for example, for us European Union citizens? You remember the so-called COVID-19 vaccines were authorized in a conditional way on the basis of the regulation of the Commission 507 of 2006, obviously in a total misuse of this regulation, but important is to say that this regulation foresees that medicinal products can be authorized in a conditional way if they are used in emergency situations in response to public health threats duly recognized by the World Health Organization. So in the future, if we have this authoritarian power of the Director General of the WHO to determine if a fake exists, we will have in continuous conditional authorization of so-called vaccines. And further, I will also explain you that the European Union is going to reform completely the pharmaceutical law. They will render legal what they did in this last year illegally. So the so-called rolling review for testing and for authorizing the medicines and so-called vaccines will become normal. So what is important is also to say that the recommendations given by the WHO are no longer not binding, because you can see they cancel the very important two words non-binding. We already saw that the national courts, not in Romania, but unfortunately in most of the other part of the European Union, only followed what the WHO said, and therefore we foresee that if they are going to cancel even these two words, non-binding, we won't have any chance to go before the courts and ask for annulment of inhuman measures. Yeah, they foresee an implementation committee which has to and a compliance committee which have to control if the WHO member states are introducing the modified international health regulations. So, consequences for us European Union citizens. We have the regulation 2371 of 2022 of the European Union Parliament and the Council on serious cross-border threats to health, which refers in an expressive way also to this modification of international health regulation and the pandemic treaty, and with which the European Union member states already declared that they will follow what at the end is voted by the International Health Assembly in May of next year. And this was never communicated to the European Union citizen. It is absolutely crazy. So we see here the Union should engage with the WHO and its member states to develop a WHO convention, agreement, or other international instrument on pandemic prevention, preparedness, and response. The Union will engage with the WHO and the member states to develop a new legally binding instrument that complements the international health regulation. The Union should also support efforts to strengthen since November of last year apply not only to the communicable diseases but also to threats of environmental origin, including those due to the climate, events which may constitute public health emergency of international concern, and the international health regulation. Also here we can find the definition of One Health, health in all policies. That means that there is the power when they declare that there is a problem also of climate nature, they then apply on the basis of this regulation together with the WHO, they can cancel our fundamental rights and freedoms. Yeah, you can see the Commission in cooperation with member states in accordance with the WHO emergency preparedness and response framework set out in the International Health Regulation shall establish a union health crisis and pandemic plan. So, there is already the obligation by December the 27th for each member state to provide the Commission and relevant Union agencies with an updated report, always based on what is decided on WHO basis. So, other consequences for us European Union citizens. We have the Council recommendation 1339 of this year on joining the global